talk that I've done this year, and so each of them is on a kind of similar theme, but my work's developing as I go. So some of the stuff that I'm talking to you about today, I've only just started researching. So a lot of stuff around music and music therapy and sort of cross-cultural analysis of music is really recent. So I'm kind of adding that. So in terms of research, you always develop an argument. Your argument is never finished. It's always in process. So I'm going to share with you today my kind of latest thoughts on my work and how music can be a mechanism by which perhaps we can overcome trauma. And that might be individual trauma, but also collective trauma. Slide, Helen. Okay. So one of the things that has been really, I think, present to all of us and has affected all of us in some way, some of you much more than others, has been the pandemic. So it was really quite shortly after the first conference on BTS that we went into lockdown. And at the time, we never thought the lockdown was going to last very long. I mean, we just didn't. I thought I'd be back teaching by September. So it's sort of an ongoing thing. So along with the pandemic came with long periods of isolation. More people were using social media, more people connecting through social media. And although there were some really good aspects of it, there were some problematic aspects as well. And I think what we're seeing at the moment has to do with those problematic aspects. The second thing that kind of I was hyper aware of, and this is because I teach media and communication, and therefore I need to kind of keep up with politics, was the US election. And which by the end I found very traumatic, keeping up with it. But one of the things that was kind of clear was that refusal to accept the election, to accept the result. Now, I was looking at some recent data today. Still, 53% of Republicans think the election was stolen. This is despite, recounts and recounts. There's still this idea that the election was stolen, and within the sort of conspiracy theory that actually Trump is still president in some shape or form. And you would be kind of surprised how many people believe some of this. So one of the things that seemed to me that things became very polarized for a number of reasons during our kind of isolation. So we saw that there was an increase in circulation of misinformation and conspiracy theories in a way that I don't think would happen outside of the internet. We're still looking at those theories now. One of the latest theories is that the vaccination, vaccine, it's like a chip in you, so that the government can kind of control your movements. And there's been discussion of that on Twitter, I think yesterday. We've also seen a rise in anti-Asian hate crimes across the world. We've seen it in the UK, we've seen it in Germany. So it's kind of, it's heightened in terms of America because of the number of people and the kind of number of attacks that we're seeing. But it's generally a kind of worldwide thing which has fed into the kind of discourse of the Chinese virus, or, and something that Trump stuck to in the very, very early days to kind of other it, if you like, to kind of create a kind of distinction. And one of the kind of articles I looked at in terms of today was talking about populism and how in politics you have this conflict between parties, and we kind of sit here in terms of absolute difference, and so we've seen that heightened as well during this kind of isolation. So so a recent report, this was just a couple of weeks ago shows 169% rise in hate crimes in the US in the first quarter of 2021. It's expected that this number will escalate more. So the divisions between groups of people seem to become magnified, and they seem to be irresolvable. There seems to be this huge division between, I mean, if you look at in terms of US, talking about the Democrats as communists, and Democrats are not communists, but communist globalists, and so it's a clear distinction and divide, which I think is growing. So my question for this is, then how do we, as a community of global citizens, we are global, and we participate. If we think about vaccine nationalism and our way out of the pandemic, then our way out of the pandemic is as global citizens, not as national citizens. We will never get out of the pandemic if we leave other countries to not be vaccinated. So there's a sense in which kind of events with wars or events with viruses, if they happen somewhere else, it doesn't really affect, or it's not really talked about. So we know these viruses, the SARS virus in Asia and viruses in India, but because it doesn't affect the rich countries, if you like, it tends to be hidden from view. So this is the first time that everybody's been in a similar position. Okay, next slide. So the kind of inspiration for this was an article in one of the, I think it's New Yorker, I can't remember, about how we would get out of the situation, and how that the stories that we told, or the stories that musicians or artists told, could provide like a roadmap out of this situation. And I think it kind of relates to that notion of it relates to that notion of stories. I mean, I think our whole lives are stories. We tell stories. Our stories are our identities. But our stories are not closed off. Our stories are not finished. Our stories have like multiple endings. And so I think that fiction can provide a mechanism through which to envisage what those endings might be, in a way that is not predetermined. I think in some senses it's quite scary not to know, that whole idea of going back to normal. And I'm not very sure that there is a normal. And I kind of think that we need to move away from that in order to come out of this, that it will be a new, that there's no going back in terms of this. But it's about imagining the future. It's about imagining possibility, about imagining transformation, about not accepting things the way they are. And I think that the arts is a very, very powerful way of doing that, despite this kind of notion in terms of governments that the arts are not a very useful subject, if I put it like that. Because they don't teach you particularly employability skills, but I would kind of argue that they do. And that's nothing more important than at the moment is mapping our way out of this situation and finding things in life that give us joy. And those things in life that give us joy are often things like books or films or music, so. And it's been interesting because I have had a couple of conversations with people kind of saying to me that the kind of music of BTS has enabled them to deal with situations that might not have been possible without BTS. So I think that the arts is a very, very valuable resource that can help us negotiate life. And certainly for me, we lived abroad, there was no TV, dubbing didn't happen. We would have the odd English program, but that was it. And so I kind of grew up reading and listening to music. Those were my kind of, that was what got me through my childhood. And it's not that I had a bad childhood, but I lived in like a fantasy world to negotiate my childhood. And that fantasy world was made up of horror books, and was made up of like, you know, pop music, R&B music. I liked the Jacksons. I listened to the Osmonds. I listened to David Cassidy. So when I was younger, so I listened to all these kind of music. Really helped me negotiate my life. I think it really helped me negotiate my life. And so it provided a space that we had like an attic, and I would go to the attic and I would put the radio on and I would listen to music. I would listen to a cassette, a record player, and I would read a book, and that would be kind of like my space, my kind of personal space. So it's like really important to me. So when I can hear these stories and the more work that I've done on BTS, I changed from kind of when I started, when I wasn't really sure of why people like them so much, to actually be someone who does like them so much. So it kind of, we talk about going down the rabbit hole. So I changed a lot in the process, and you know, things make me happy, things make me smile, and I think these days those are very, very useful things, and it reminds me of when I was younger. So Dutton talks about deep-rooted or thick divisions. So thick is just an example. He's using the term thick just to make reference to the fact they're not very easy to resolve. You know, thin permeable divisions are quite easy, but thick divisions are very difficult to resolve. So, and he refers to a study, and I'm going to refer to a couple of other studies, which researchers who have been looking at fiction as a mechanism to boost empathy. And there was a study at Washington University where they scanned the brains of participants as they read stories, and they found that the readers' brains reacted when a character's goal changed. So I suppose I'm bringing together sort of music theory, philosophy, but also psychology and cognitive theory. So, and I think it also, you know, I think it also, for people who say, well, this doesn't work, or music or fiction can't help, or, you know, if you look at these studies, there is a lot of work that has already been done that has shown that actually changes to the way in which we interact with things can happen through these things. There was a recent study on resilience during COVID-19, which looked at people who watched horror films, and they found that people who watched horror films tended to be more resilient during COVID-19 than people who didn't watch horror films. So there's some really interesting research coming out of this as well. Okay, next slide. Thanks. So a lot of us are very sad that we no longer have the kind of the original kind of healing through artist healing through music. We haven't got that anymore. That changed with the kind of growth of the company. So in 2005, it was the mission statement was that it would be music for healing. So in a recent interview in Variety, Bansky had commented, he was asked about his kind of management goals, his philosophy. He says, why are we doing this and what are we doing? Are questions I asked. And I think this is reflected in our mission statement, music and artists for healing. So even though we might not have that, you know, as a kind of logo anymore, it's still a fundamental decision in terms of the organisation and company and what it's for. And if you look at research on this kind of area of business, you will find that organisations that treat their staff well, that look after their staff, that look after people, that give proper holidays, actually are much more economically viable and financially profitable. So it's not just about saying, you know, these things make business sense. It's like inclusivity and diversity does make business sense. So you have a kind of management style, and so at the time all of us kind of know those stories, and I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but certainly there was a lot of exploitation in the music industry in Korea when it started. I can say that there's still exploitation in the music industry generally, not just in Korea, okay? But there were very, very long contracts that idols on, and very, very regimented, and they didn't get paid very much. I think Big Hit is the only company that didn't force their idols to have to repay their debt. So when you watch some of the groups, they haven't repaid their debt yet, so they don't get paid anything. And some groups actually disband without getting paid anything. So I think this is changing, but I think the kind of idea was to do something different with the industry, and it kind of makes financial sense. These things make financial sense. You look after people, they are more productive, and they are happier, and therefore, you know, you kind of, in sort of capitalism, you make more money. Everybody has to be paid. Okay, so I looked at another study just this morning when I was putting some more of this together, which by a doctor, which was looking at music having an effect on improving motor and cognitive function in stroke patients, reducing symptoms of depression in patients suffering from dementia, even helping patients undergo surgery to experience less pain and heal faster. And of course it can be therapeutic. And the study was looking at lung cancer patients, and it kind of demonstrated that the patients who had sort of music, had some sort of musical therapy before going down to theatre, actually suffered a lot less pain post-operatively and actually recovered quickly. So there's really interesting kind of evidence that you know, I'm not just pulling this out of nowhere, and we're not just saying, you know, as fans of BTS, that the music's healing. We're actually saying, well, there is scientific evidence that suggests this is the case. You know, you could, my kind of research is on BTS, but you could look at other groups in respect of this as well. Somebody like Lady Gaga, I've had many students, you know, have that kind of connection with her, and her connection with and I think for me, in terms of music, if you wanted me to make a comparison in terms of what you know, people got out of it, that is the kind of the Western comparison I would make. That would be the comparison I would make. Okay, and it's also something which is situated in a notion of marginality and difference, and also of acceptance. So I think those things are also very, very important. And certainly, you know, I always say this, but if you are going to set yourself up to speak for young people, you can't just speak for some people, you have to speak for everybody. You know, it doesn't work otherwise. So for me, that's a very, you know, I think from the very beginning that they have always been quite outspoken in as much as they can do. There are restrictions, But you can say things in different ways. For example, if you look at American cinema, film noir, which is like a dark cinema of the kind of 1940s, 50s, there were a lot of restrictions on what filmmakers could do, and the cinema is really about sexuality and desire and crime. And what the directors would do is they would display stuff. So they would put stuff onto like the frame and the mise en scene, the clothes people wore, the things they said, that would be obvious to the audience who knew that kind of language, but would get around the censor. So I think that, you know, you don't always have to say things outright for them to be said explicitly. Okay, next slide. Thanks. Okay, so here's the theory. I think one of the things I don't want you to worry about is theory. I don't, you know. I did once in my horror find someone had analysed a review I'd done on Reddit. I was complaining about my jargon. So I'm kind of aware of that. So, and I kind of think that jargon in academia is gatekeeping. And I'm going to try not to do that. So if something's not clear, please ask me. It's not you, it's the fact that I'm not explaining it very well. I think that theory isn't that difficult, but I think the language that is used is difficult. And I think because a lot of that theory comes from a very European intellectual white tradition in which it's meant to keep other people out. And so part of what I'm doing here is also part of my other work, which is the decolonization of the curriculum. And part of the decolonization of the curriculum is also about making theory understandable. It's not about saying this theory is too difficult. It's saying actually this theory is not that difficult. It's just a way we're explaining it doesn't make sense. It's the onus on us, because why should people be excluded? So I feel that really strongly. So I'm bringing together three different theorists here. So Deleuze is a French theorist, and whenever you're thinking about French theorists, they write in French and it's translated, so that you're always dealing with a translation. And I know that some of you are translators for BTS. I do fan translations, and so I want to thank you and say how grateful I am. But you know how difficult that actor translation is. So we were talking about this yesterday, and as someone who hasn't got, I try, but I'm not very good, but I keep on trying, is I'll look across a variety of translations to get an idea. So language is never fixed. It's, you know, when you translate something, it's fixed in terms of what decisions you make about what it says. And if you look at like full translations, they won't necessarily say the same thing. That doesn't mean that any of those is wrong. It just means that, you know, meaning's just not fixed. And I think RM does this really, really well. I think he plays with language. I think he's very knowledgeable. He speaks, I mean, he's fluent in at least 3 languages, if not 4 languages. So I think that really helps when he does lyrics, because he's playing on the kind of interpretation, he's playing on interpretation. So something isn't fixed, and therefore you're dealing with an interpretation. So just remember, when, especially with French philosophers, it's all an interpretation, a translation. The second theorist that I'm looking at is Bell Hooks. Now, Bell Hooks is somebody that I started reading when I came into academia, and when I taught on a course in African American and mainstream cinema in the US. And I taught with a colleague who was Black British. And that's when I kind of started reading Bell Hooks' work. She is an extremely influential thinker, cultural critic. Perhaps, you know, there are a number of kind of Black women who are so influential in terms of kind of pushing thought forward and thinking about, you know, how to you know, how to position yourself in regards to popular culture. But bell hooks is kind of with Maria Angelou and Toni Morrison, who's writing, are these key thinkers who have been really important in pushing the discourse forward. So bell hooks' work on radical love is something that I've started looking at a lot and kind of making a lot of sense to me. It's good to have different voices. So Deleuze is a French philosopher. Bell hooks is a cultural critic. Christopher Small is a music theorist. So the work I'm doing is interdisciplinary, and all that means is that I look across disciplines and I use what I find useful in terms of what I'm doing. For me, that is much more interesting than, say, just using philosophy or just using cultural studies, because each of them is positioned in relation to the subject in a different way, and it opens your eyes up and it makes you see things differently. So yeah, I mean, I've also, in my kind of work on BTS, I've looked at choreography, I've looked at dance, I've looked at kind of music theory, and I'm absolutely tone deaf, but it's been really, really interesting, I have to say. So I'm kind of learning, so I'm kind of on a journey. I'm on like a voyage of discovery in terms of the work I'm doing. So I'm bringing these three thinkers, really important thinkers, together. The next slide, please. Okay, so this is the original one, which is Big Hit Music and Artists for Healing, which would be at the beginning of all their kind of videos and now is lost in the ether. But on sort of, you can find it on Google Images. Next slide, please.
There you go.
Okay, I have used this slide. I have used this one before, but I think it just kind of centralizes. And I'm going to go through some of the next slides quite quickly because it just kind of sets it up. And I wish BTS would stop posting stuff during my talk. It's coming up on my other slide. Okay, so this is a work of Victor on radical love and politics. And I've talked about this before, but I think that what BTS do is they pay it forward a lot as well. So their work is always about uplifting us up. And at the very end of this, I'm going to refer to Bicycle that Iron dropped a few days ago as part of the Festa, and look at how that kind of relates to what we're doing. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is kind of the general idea of kind of love as a feeling, and I want to kind of get on to some of the later stuff because my presentation got a bit longer. Okay, so but this is something that Bell Hooks talks about, and we're going to end up with her. She talks about love as an ethic, a responsibility, commitment to truth, a way of overcoming domination, oppression, and subordination. I think it's such an important thing, because remember that, you know, this call for radical love is not coming from the people in charge. It's coming from the people who are oppressed. It's coming from the people who have been treated historically and contemporarily in appalling ways, for them to actually reach out and say that we don't want this division to continue, that the only way to overcome this is to reach out rather than reinforce those divisions. Next slide, please. Okay, so I do this quite quickly. So I think some of you know about the Love Myself campaign with UNICEF. And there's this campaign that goes back to 2017. And I think this also really encapsulates Bansheer's vision for BTS. as kind of leaders, youth leaders, as role models, and as wanting the world to be better for the next generation. And I think it's all, you know, when you get older, you always want the world to be better for younger people. You don't want them to go through the things you went through. So you want to see that change happen. And it's important that that change happens. So these are campaigns about children and teens around the world. Because children and teens around the world are caught up in situations which are beyond them. But they are the next generation that perhaps have the potentiality to change these things. These are the people who will be the next generation leaders. Next slide, please. Okay, this also connects to the Love Yourself series of albums, which I had talked about before. It's a series of 3 albums and 1 sort of long video, which is a kind of story. It's a story about love. And story about love goes from a story about loving someone else to a recognition that you can only love other people if you love yourself first. And so that is a kind of really powerful message. And I think if you're struggling, at whatever age you're struggling, that you're struggling with life because you don't love yourself, because you've lost your love for yourself. You don't see yourself as lovable. And so that kind of message of finding, of being good enough, I think it's a message of being good enough to love yourself. I think it's a really powerful message, and it's something that continues and will continue, you know, in their work. They will leave this kind of quite substantial legacy to music, but also to youth culture and to politics. Next slide, please. Okay, so this was a recent renewal of the campaign, and you know, we're all aware of what's happening in Israel and the kind of situation there, and a lot of young people and children are being caught up in this conflict. And again, it's a conflict that there is no easy solution to. It has been going on for a long time. One of the things I've been watching on kind of YouTube is that there is a program that's happening that brings together people across the divide to actually form like a pressure group to perhaps change things. But, you know, young people are very much caught up in these things. And so I think that this recommitment to it happened at a really, really important time in the world and sort of move things forward. Next slide, please. Okay, and that was just the slide. And also one of the other things I think they've done really well with is actually provided a voice for those of us struggling in COVID-19, struggling with being lonely, being trapped in our rooms. And this sense of togetherness, I think, is something that has really helped to bring some of us through this. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this is just timeline of events. So 2017, the launch of it. And the most recent one is a post on Stop Asian Hate. So they are kind of speaking for the community, and they always kind of take time to think things through. And I think this is because of language, because they need to be very careful with what you say, because it will be translated in so many different languages. But very much, you know, this notion of leadership and role model in terms of young people, I think is really important. Next slide, thanks. Okay, so this was the recent thing. So this commitment to reimagining a kind of safer and more connected world. I mean, that kind of is the crux of the argument, and the way in which music can allow us to do that, to reimagine, to tell new stories, to write new endings, to transform things, to change things. Next slide, please. Okay, and this is kind of the final kind of still from this video. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some of the theory now. And as I said, you know, just don't worry too much. I might not explain it very well. I did this for my PhD. Even I now look at my PhD and think, what are you talking about? But I spent like 7 years on it, and I read all these philosophy books. But I never kind of left it behind, because I find it, I just like philosophy. I do. I like this notion of you know, why are we here? And I like teaching it, I like reading it. But it is a bit intractable. It is a bit difficult sometimes. And I had a student once that put, so Deleuze used to write with somebody called Guattari. So Deleuze and Guattari, they wrote these books on anti-capitalism and schizophrenia. And I once had like a first year student put one of the books on her bibliography. I don't know. Because I think that they write in a certain way which is not very logical. That's that they're kind of they're trying to dismantle the way things work from within. So it doesn't, a lot of the time, especially when they write together, it doesn't necessarily make that much sense because it's not meant to, because they're playing with language. I kind of find the work that Deleuze does on his own, especially his books on cinema, much better because they have kind of concrete examples. But the work has the same kind of basis, has the same foundation. So one of the things that I have in the title of this paper is becoming other. And so this notion of becoming other is a concept which is beyond binaries, and we talk a lot about binaries in terms of identity and gender, but also how those kind of binaries are no longer perhaps as applicable to who we are now. So that you know, I think we're in LGBT month, and we've been talking about like pronouns and identities. So what becomes really interesting is kind of the work of Deleuze and Guattari becomes really applicable to this moment, because they're talking about those identities, like a non-binary identity, which you know is not about a fixed identity. And this is really the kind of the idea of becoming other, is that it's about transforming, but there is no fixed end, and there's something very liberationary. So traditionally in kind of Western thought, and I think this is different in Eastern thought, is that you have this idea of identity as something which is really fixed and really immutable and that never changes. And they're kind of writing against it. So they're talking about diversity, multiplicity. They see identity as something which oppresses people. So that they were kind of writing in the 1960s and 70s at a time when there was a kind of intellectual revolution in France, especially amongst people at universities. And there was a period when it seemed as if there was going to be some sort of intellectual revolution, but it never really happened. So a lot of the thinking comes out of that particular period. So it's always good to thought about, where is this historically? So it proposes breaking out of our old outlived habits and attitudes as to creatively bring into being that which does not yet exist. So I love this idea that something that does not yet exist, because that is exciting, that is powerful, that is change and transformation. I talk about this in terms of BTS's transmedia work, in terms of, you know, that the BU universe, that it's never fixed. You're always adding layers onto layers, and you can engage with it in any way you like and construct your own stories. So, and I kind of think it's the same here. So Claire Colbrett, who wrote this quite short book on Deleuze, which I do, if you want to read it, that would be my recommendation, which is read her book. She says, life is just change, becoming, or creation, producing further lines of change and becoming by creating ever more complex folds. This means that life is always active and creative, affirming the power to become. So that's because I think one of the things that I'm trying to think through is in that kind of moment when we kind of are listening to music, and we've been doing this with oh God, let me just, my mind's gone blank for a minute. But we've been doing this with streaming, and so we've been doing this on Stationhead, where first time in my life I have ever been in a streaming party. And people have been having conversations, and so I think there's something there in that kind of, when we're listening together, when we're talking together, and when we're you know, being informed by the music, is kind of something, you know, that I think is kind of really powerful, that I kind of see happening. If anybody has to leave, do not worry. Okay, we are taping it, so thank you for coming. Okay, so and Deleuze does talk about music. He says about music to free itself, it will have to pass over to the other side, where territories tremble, where the structures collapse. One of the best ways of thinking about their work is thinking about a rhizome, and a rhizome is a series of connections that aren't logical. It's the opposite to a tracing, a map that tells you where to go. I always think of this in terms of Duel the Grudge, the kind of remake of it by Shimizu, when the character played by Sarah Michelle Gellar is in Japan, and she looks at the kind of tube station and she doesn't know where to go. She has no idea how to find her way, and because she has no idea how to find her way, you will move into different types of connections. Whereas if she was in New York, where she lived, she knows that map. So I think that's the way to think about it. They're trying to say, you know, there are no fixed connections. They're kind of routes that go off it. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so musicking by Christopher Small, and this only kind of came up when I was kind of searching, and I changed what I was doing because I was going to do something different. I was going to do something that we were going to do in Korea. We were meant to be going in and giving a paper at the music conference, which was actually has been put off for a year. So I decided to do something different. So Christopher Small comes up with this, and I think this is something that I want us to think about and you know, think about how this works. He says to music is to take part in any capacity in a music performance. So when I'm talking about Stationhead, this is what I'm talking about. We're musicking when we're listening to Stationhead. When we are streaming together, we are participating in the performance. By providing material for the performance, composing, or by dancing, we might at times even extend its meaning to what person is doing, who takes the tickets to the door, the hefty man who shut the piano, because he's writing this, you know, in 1998. And the drums, or the roadies who set up the instruments and carry out sound checks, or the cleaners. So this is a really wide sense of what musicking is, or what we have to think about in terms of how music works. He says they too are all contributing to the nature of the event that's music performance. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the kind of third main theorist for today, bell hooks. She says, I really believe that love as political transformation force in our society can change the world. It's been love that motivates people to the most deep and profound change. It's not about going soft at all. It's about knowing what can save our planet, which is people connecting, communicating, showing loving kindness. So we often use this kind of hashtag be kind on Twitter, but I think we often forget to be kind, you know, and I was having a conversation with somebody about, you know, people that kind of make mistakes. And I think that as long as somebody owns up to their mistakes and grows from it, that you have to allow people to change, have to, you know, so the world's not going to get better if we just, and logically you kind of think, well, there's no point having prisons, is there? Because prisons, for me, are about rehabilitation. So, you know, I think this big kindness and reach out is a very important theory and a very important part to kind of getting us out of where we are. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to talk about this really quickly because I really don't have time for this. This is an example. This is just another example, but this is an example of how it works in politics. And again, I came across this and I thought it was kind of interesting. Hochschild's writing about Trump, but she's writing about it in context of 2016 when he got in for the first time. The other example is an election for a mayor in Turkey, and the election was put aside, and so there had to be kind of a re-election, and the opposing party managed to make gains because they decided to run the campaign in terms of radical love. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm not going to go into this. This was the Istanbul mayor election of 2019. There is a kind of link on the slides, and I'm happy for people to have access to the slides so that you can actually go to that link. When did the world become this loveless is one of the things that we talked about, and this is kind of a really powerful example. So when we talk about populism and about divide between politicians, which is what we see in the US in particular, the reason that they won the thing was because they didn't say this is the negative of the other side, this is why they're bad. They said, actually, we're going to reach out to the people, we're going to listen to you, we're going to reach out in love. Next slide, please. So you can see some of these from Twitter. So what happened in Istanbul's rerun elections is a huge deal. Headline, authoritarian populism just got defeated by a political strategy called radical love. And it was astonishing to poll. So what I'm saying to you about radical love, it does work. It does, it's not just a theory, it does work. And it has worked really recently. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is just a couple more slides. So find a neighbour who doesn't think of you and give them a hug. And so this kind of reaching out was something that, you wonder, that is a way for perhaps politics to kind of heal itself in campaigns. Next slide, please. Okay, so that was just a general series of slides. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so let's kind of get back to a bit of the theory. But that's an example. So Mazzella and all, in their kind of work on ethnography and musicology, and ethnography is a research method when you actually go into the community. So they do some cross-cultural analysis as well. So they went to China, I'm not sure, but they went to participate in kind of shamanism and shamanism rites, and so So it's in really interesting way. So all ethnography means is you go amongst the people and you become part of that community, and you're kind of an insider, if you like. So they say we propose that the notions of becoming effect, noticing singularity, assemblage and experimentation can enhance the understanding of musical practices by figuring them as ontology open-ended in terms of their social and mental potential. So really, of all that kind of mouthful, what is important there is this knowledge of open-ended, this knowledge that there aren't fixed meanings, and the knowledge that each performance changes the meaning and transforms the meaning. And they go on to say, we conceive of the task of music studies informed by the concepts of becoming, so you're using the Deleuze here, and noticing to be about discovering what knowledges and identities related to music we may have unnecessarily fixed. So they want to get outside of this kind of fixed notion of what music is to find out what music may be and the potentiality of music. Who or what these stabilized formations may prioritize and marginalize, and what as yet unrecognizable processes might be flowing within phenomena we thought we had grasped. And this is really the point of Deleuze. It's about thinking differently. It's about thinking, how can I see things differently? How do you see this situation in a different way? And that's how knowledge works, you know, because fixed knowledge is a bad thing. It doesn't help anybody. You need to be pushing on. Okay, and they're thinking this through in terms of how they research and their processes. Next slide, please. Okay, so the research in this area, as I said before, is that music has provided a mechanism for healing that goes quite a long way back. And so after World War I, community musicians traveled to veterans' hospitals, played for wounded soldiers. You can take this back even further to like, you know, musicians at palaces and musicians during the war. So, you know, there's a really long history of music as an integral part of identity and healing and your kind of identification. So I think it's really interesting. So what was discovered was that actually it had an impact on their emotional trauma. It helped heal their trauma. So the first musical therapy degree program in the world was founded in 1944 at Michigan State. 50 years later, in 1994, music therapy became a reimbursable service for hospitalized patients. Because you're an American, you used to have to pay for it. Mm. In an article in Pitchfork that I circulated around the other day, it's about music and healing. I think one of the best articles I've read in a long time. The writer goes to a musical therapist, and she says to him, our bodies react to sound, she says later. We connect readily to music and sound because we are, in our essence, music, made of vibration, which is movement, which is life. And for me, I don't know, it's such a profound thing to say, I think, a profound thing of our connections to music, our connection to, and the notion of vibration and intensity, which kind of link into what I'm thinking about. Next slide, please. Okay, so there's some other work that I'm just going to signal because I'm going to finish. So some of the other work I'm doing is looking at music in very, very early years of childhood. And so one of the things I think with language is that language impedes us, so that when we watch a film or when we watch a TV program, which is in a different language, even if we have subtitles on, our kind of engagement with it is quite complex. I think much more complex, and sometimes I think that we do not perhaps pick up on some of the universal things as we could. I think music is different. So in theory, if you kind of went to kind of sort of psychology or psychoanalytic theory, it would be that music is kind of pre-language. So language happens when you're born, and when somebody says this is a boy or this is a girl, and you're given a name. But this is kind of before that. So people like Christava talk about the pre-symbolic. So, but it's just, you know, when you're first born and you don't understand language, but you have music, you know, many parents, lullabies. My mother always used to sing, oh God, I can't remember. So full. She used to sing songs to me when I was very young, and I can remember those, even if I'm too old to remember what yes, You're My Sunshine, that was her song, that was her song. So I grew up and then I sung it to my cat. So there's kind of circular thing here. But yeah, I think there's something really universal about language and about our early music and about our early experience of language, which can, some of what I'm doing is on intercultural communication, cross-cultural analysis. And so I'm interested in some of what is being done on cross-cultural analysis of music, which is suggesting that certain tones and certain rhythms are cross cultures. So it's a really interesting area of explanation. So next slide, please. Okay, so this was Bicycle by RM. And I took this from Dulcet Lyrics, and it's right. I put the thing. She's somebody that I like her interpretations. So Bicycle dropped a few days ago, and it's like a gift during Festa. There's these gifts for fans. And he talks about it's very, I mean, with his work, it's always very sort of, it was literal and metaphorical. So it means what it is, which is going for a bike ride, but it's also about a commentary on life as such. Next slide, please. So these are some of the responses. So categorize bicycle's genre as comfort. Somebody else, bicycle feels like we're riding next to Junie, sitting by the Han River. Well, I would be if it hadn't been for the pandemic. So it's quite sad. Filled with deep, heartfelt conversations. Next slide, please. So this is from BTS Press. RM's way with words can't be described in words. He is insightful, thoughtful, and comforting when it comes to music. The soulful lyrics of Bicycle truly is a testament to RM's music, which has so much depth. And then we had the short version of this. It's so healing, and his voice fits so perfectly with the song. I love this so much. So this is, you know, I always think you need to look at people's reactions, but this notion of comfort, this notion of healing is still very much embedded within the work. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think I will probably going to slip over this guy. The only one I want to think is to look at some cross-cultural things. So they talk about music performance with special powers of supernatural forces, widespread belief that music has a profound effect on our minds and bodies and can ameliorate physical and mental problems. So you have perhaps what an Eastern way of looking at this, and you have a Western, which is a scientific way, but they're both saying exactly the same thing, but just they have different concepts of the body. And next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to go off. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to conclude. Hayes talks about what are some of the emotions that get written about in politics these days. Shame, envy, anger, hate, fear, dread, despair, and love. In the age of Trump, Netanyahu, and many others we could mention, not surprisingly, much of the political discourse is taken with discussions of anger, rage, violence, and despair, and less so hope and love. And we are seeing that. Next slide, please. So how do we deal with this? So we go back to Bell Hooks and her call for love. She says, rarely, if ever, are any of us healed in isolation. Healing is an act of communion. So I don't think that we can come out of this on our own. I think we need to come out of this together, connected, better connected to each other. In an earlier work, she says, which has just been republished, a culture of domination is anti-love. It requires violence to sustain itself. To choose love is to go against prevailing values of the culture. Many people feel unable to love either themselves or others because they do not know what love is. So if we go back to Healing BTS and their work on Love Myself, it connects in with this kind of theory of, you know, how we live, how we resolve conflict. Further in this essay, and if anybody's interested, I've got a link for it and I can let you have it. I only just found this today. When masses of Black folks started thinking solely in terms of us and them, and she's talking about, you know, in the 1960s, internalizing the value system of white supremacy, capitalist patriarchy. Is a lot of words, okay? All that means is, you know, certainly in the 1960s, white people in power and did everything to maintain that power, including the police in America. The moment, and she goes on, the moment we choose to love, we begin to move against domination, against oppression. The moment we choose to love, we begin to move towards freedom, to act in ways that liberate ourselves and others. That action is testimony of love as a practice of freedom. And I'm going to end there. Yeah.
There we go. Thank you, Colette. Excellently presented. I hope the slides were moving quick enough for you. I was looking at them on my phone as well. I looked in twice so I could see it was working. Thank you. A pleasure. There's a couple of thanks in the chat for a couple of people who had to go early. However, for the rest of you, please feel free now to share your questions with Colette. You can either write them in the chat, and I'm quite happy to read those out. I'll put your hand up and you can put your camera on and your microphone on if you wish. I realise that'll take some time if you're typing, so I'm more than happy to kick off with the first question. Colette, I've got loads of questions, but I think the one that's really struck me is you were talking about ethnography, and ethnography is all about giving voice to the people you are researching. So this idea of giving voice seems to me to parallel moving away from that sort of as you just said, the white supremacist patriarchal view of research, the gatekeeping of theory, because within the research area of BTS, actually, it's the fan culture has knocked down the barrier of gatekeeping by translating and sharing online. So I'm just thinking about how that fan culture might actually impact a change of research methodology, but also what academics, theorists, writers and researchers could learn from the fan-based culture as well.
I mean, I think it's one of the things that I think has kind of informed me so much has been being part of the fandom and seeing what the fans do. I mean, seeing the kind of fan labour, the kind of translation, but also the charity projects, the education, and there's accounts doing stuff around disability in BTS. We've got a couple of deaf accounts and who are translating the lyrics and talking to you know, fans about, you know, how they experience and how they feel music and I think, yeah, it seems to me, I mean, one of the things that kind of has happened is that theory has been like this white place in the castle, if you like, and one of the things that I wanted to do when I first thought about the conference was that I wanted to let people speak. I wanted to hear people because I felt that the fans were not being listened to, and they would. And actually, my kind of perception is that the fans are the experts. They know much more than we do, much more than, I mean, I can't keep up with it all because I have other things that I have to do. But I think of them as the experts, as those people that know. And you know, so it was kind of like when I started doing some of this around healing and therapy, particularly with the Pitchfork article, which I just thought was so good. that actually people had conversations with me about their experiences, and so, and I think you can never ever, oh God, get that elsewhere, sorry.
Well, at least it's the right theme tune, Colette, for the talk BTS coming through while answering the question.
Sorry, no, I have it on because I'm waiting for my hospital to ring me, and my nurse is only on